part 2 of your passive introduction, you saw that in the present and the imperfect, the endings were the same as the middle. This goes for other moods. So if you find yourself needing to deal with present infinitives, imperatives or participles, they will all be the same as the middle. So you don't need to worry about them. So the present is the same as the middle. In the aorist, you are again dealing with the introduction of a theta. So the aorist infinitive, lusai in the active, lusasthai in the middle, lutherni in the passive. The imperative, luson, lusata in the active, lusai, lusasther in the middle, luther, they're both going to have thers in them, and then therti, therter. And finally, participle, you want thase, thesa, then. Now, page 169 in Duff demotes this to a footnote and puts all of the endings for the participle into a footnote. I do think it's important you pay attention to this. It's another 313 participle, so it's not an impossible one to learn. It's just like the participles you already see in chapter 14 in its basic approach, because there are a couple of verbs where it does get used an awful lot. As a standard aorist passive participle, no it doesn't, but there are a couple of examples where it does get used an awful lot, and you will see it an awful lot, and therefore it is important you're aware that aorist passive participles are a thing. So, I said remember that very few words have both an active and a middle. There are some, you can count them on your fingers as far as they matter, and that's when we have to start thinking about where voice really matters and what does the difference make. Luo, I untie, luomai, I ransom. Not actually used in the New Testament. Luomai, I am untied, or potentially I am ransomed. Enduo, I dress someone. Enduomai, I dress myself. So kind of reflexive idea. And enduomai, I am dressed. So the middle potentially has something to do with self-referentiality, a lack of a direct object that's not included in the subject, reflexivity, intransitivity. Patho, I persuade. Pathomai, I obey. Pathomai, therefore I am persuaded, potentially I am obeyed. This is one of the areas of Greek grammar that people are still writing books about, still researching, still thinking about. If you're interested in it further, I can point you towards places where you can find out more information. For now, very few verbs have both an active and a middle. Where they do, the middle has a related meaning that's going to have something to do with reflecting that verb back on itself. So it does matter in some places. Most of the time, just learn, is a verb active or is it middle? Because it's almost certainly not both. There are some places where this is really clear, because if you take verbs like akuo, genosko, horao, lambano and bino, they're all active in the present and middle in the future. Some people say this is because the future hasn't happened and there's still something slightly unreal about it, and that the middle allows it to be more reflexive and therefore less real, and therefore the middle suits the future. That sounds a bit contorted to me, but it is certainly a fact. There is a whole pattern of irregular verb where the present is active and the future is middle. We'll look at learning irregular verbs in chapter 18 more thoroughly, and you've already done some in chapter 11, so start building up charts of how all of these work, but this is one of the patterns you can look out for. There are a few verbs which muddle all of this up. Take the examples on the screen. I fear dogs, I am afraid of dogs, I am afeared. I fear dogs, that's a straightforward SVO, subject, verb, object. I am the subject, fear is the verb, dog's the object. How about I'm afraid of dogs? You've now got subject, verb, something associated with a verb that completes it. And that I am afraid is now your passive construction. in English, that's how you do the passive. I am carried. I am untied. How about I am afraid? Well, that's giving you the idea I am made to feel fear by dogs. So you can see the dog's taking that agency role that you see in the passive. So fear is one of those odd things. You can only be afraid because something makes you afraid. And therefore, although it can be expressed actively, I fear dogs, it is to some extent always a responsive action, and therefore may be expressed using more passive language. And you can see that very clearly in the more Shakespearean I am afeared. It's not something we'd say nowadays, but it is there in English. It shows you very clearly that fear has been added into me. So fear is a really clear example of this, and it's true in a lot of languages that fear acts like this. It's linguistically crossing over the difference between active and passive. There are 4 verbs like this in Greek that you need to think about. Phobumai, I fear, which we just talked about. Apokrinomai, I reply. And that kind of makes sense too, because if you're replying, you've got to be replying to something. Therefore, although it's an action that you are choosing to do, it's a provoked action. So you can think of both of these to some extent as provoked actions. If you look through the dictionary, apokrinomai used to be apokrino, and it's changed over time to move from an active form to this form that doesn't quite take active endings. And what you find with both phobumai and apokrinomai is you get a complete mix of both middle and passive endings. So these mix middle and passive endings whilst having clearly active meanings. The same is true of boulamai and poiomai. Boulamai means I want. Poiomai means I journey. It originally had an idea of kind of going on a route march kind of thing across country. So it gets used in the New Testament when you're journeying, like going between cities kind of journey. So it's not go in the sense of erchomai, just going house to house or walking along the street. It's much more the journey to Jerusalem. Both of those also mix up middle and passive endings. So you basically anything goes. That means you're going to see apokrythes a lot in the aorist passive form, which I told you the aorist passive participle is going to crop up in one particular thing. And that's going to basically mean in reply, because it's having replied. And you're going to see apekrythe. He replied a lot. And often, Jesus isn't actually replying to anyone, he's replying to the context. So apokrinomai is often used just to kind of keep the narrative flowing, that Jesus is responding to the Pharisees looking at him funny, or general murmuring among a crowd. He's not replying to speech, he's replying to a context. And it gives you this ongoing sense in Luke's Gospel of the speech and the thought and the discussion that's happening. These are what we would call deponent verbs. So now I do want you to use the term deponent, which I've mentioned before and told you to ignore. They're called passive deponents in the book. That's overstressing it, I think. But what you've got is a group of words whose form, a mix of passive and middle, does not match their use and meaning, which is very much an active idea. So these 4 verbs you need to learn carefully. Finally, a word about irregular verbs. He does give you a series of irregular passives. 2 examples. Akuo gives you erkusthen, where you've gained a sigma. And lambano erlempthen, which I've given you just because it's a beautiful example of how random a Greek verb can look. That does not look like lambano. It's a complete mess. They've still got the theta eta in them, but you've got to learn these very carefully. When we get to chapter 18, you're going to see proper tables on how to do this. They're called principal parts. I've already given you some information on principal parts. So what I just said you do now is any verb lists you're keeping, go back and add aorist passives into them, and look at pages 253 and following for charts to do that. So we'll talk more about how to learn these and the overall system, but I want you to be aware of the fact that there are a number of irregular ones. Duff gives you a short list. It is important to learn them. That's chapter 15. Now to use it.